He has worked on these questions since the 1970s, and one of his books, Does Altruism Exist?, was published in Norwegian in 2015 under the title Finnes Altruisme. I think it's possible to buy it over there, and surely to have it signed as well. Sure. So, I said we are going to discuss big questions. And the main question is, what kind of species are we actually? Are human beings greedy creatures seeking to maximize our self-interest, if necessary, to the damage of others? Or are we evolutionary disposed to care about the welfare of others? If necessary, sacrificing our personal interests and in extreme cases our lives for the common good. And in the discussion of these questions, it's often referred to biology. What is natural? We use parallels and metaphors from biology, like it's a jungle out there, to underline our arguments. But what does biological science really tell us? Are we selfish or are we altruist? So, David, why did you first take interest in this field?
Okay, well, thank you, and of course, it's so happy to be here, and to follow my good friend Dag Hessen, with whom I had breakfast this morning, and we've been working together for several years, and so it's a privilege to be working with Dag and some of my other colleagues in Norway. So we can begin with some big questions that apply to all species, not just humans, and it's based on Darwin's theory of natural selection, which more or less says that, that behaviors evolve that increase the fitness of some individuals better than other individuals. And so that would seem to be a description of selfishness. Selfishness causes me to gain at your expense. And so is that not the outcome of evolution? And the answer is yes, sometimes, but there is something else to consider, which is that when any species lives in groups, then natural selection is taking place at two levels. It's taking place within the group, and that's favoring selfishness. If all that matters is for me to do better than you within a group, then I will be selfish. But it's also based on groups doing better than other groups. And in that case, that calls for not just altruism, but cooperation in all its forms, which will cause a group to have an advantage over another group. And so as soon as we think of evolution as operating at more than one level, then we have the intellectual resources to explain not just selfishness, but also altruism. So it's not true that evolution explains selfishness well and altruism poorly. It explains both, but what actually evolves depends on the conditions. And well, go ahead, take it from there.
Yeah, okay, we'll come back to that. But I think first, how should we define altruism?
Well, altruism can be defined both in terms of action and in terms of how we think and feel. And it's very important to distinguish between the two. They're both important, but the relationship between them is quite complex. I can judge you by your actions. If you do something which is clearly benefiting others at your own material expense, I can call that altruistic, if you perform some act of heroism, for example. Now, why did you do it? What were you thinking when you did it? There's always a multiplicity of reasons. It might be that you were thinking of yourself as being altruistic, or perhaps you were thinking you might get into heaven. Perhaps you took some kind of psychological pleasure from it. There's always what you could call a many-to-one relationship between how we think and feel and how we act. But natural selection sees only actions. And how we think and feel are the mechanisms behind the actions. And we need to be most concerned with actions. And then how we think and feel about it, of course, is important. But we shouldn't care so much how we think and feel about it as long as we actually do what needs to be done. And I should say that, you know, I'm in this situation all the time. As an evolutionist, I often work with religious believers. And so there's a big difference. But as long as we're trying to do the same thing in a communitarian way, we don't care because we have a common goal.
But it seems, though, natural for us to think that in order to act altruistic, you have to have altruistic motives.
Well, not everyone thinks that. Economists often think that a free market is the best way for society to run well. And in a free market, of course, you only care about making money for yourself. So, and then there's many people that more or less think in terms of enlightened self-interest. Bertrand Russell, for example, the philosopher, more or less thought in terms of enlightened self-interest. That the way to benefit, the enlightened form of selfishness is to more or less be altruistic, but you can see it through an individualistic lens. So I think that now, when you actually look with studies, as I have done, and you measure people's prosociality, when you ask them and you ask, is it important, do you think it's important to help others in your society as a whole? You get a bell-shaped distribution, and as it turns out, it is the ones who actually think that way, who think prosocially, that actually end up behaving that way, at least statistically. So I think in general, we do want to make it easy for people to be genuinely other-oriented, to see it at face value, and to think of themselves as altruism. That's a good way to think and feel, and is worth spreading.
I'm going to confront you with a couple of dilemmas concerning deeds and motives later on. But your conclusion is definitely that altruism exists. So that's the answer to your question in the book title.
Well, the answer is yes and no, but there's a yes.
Yeah. But not everybody would agree. And you mentioned it briefly that some people would say that there is always an element of selfishness behind altruism. How would you comment on that?
I would say that part of what's going on here is multiple perspectives. We have to be multilingual in the way we think about these things, and to realize that there's more than one language that people are, or more than one worldview that you might say, and statements that issue from one worldview need to be translated into another worldview. So the everything is selfish worldview is something that actually does admit cooperation. You take someone like Richard Dawkins in his selfish gene concept. So in some sense, he's saying that everything is selfish at the genetic level. But if you unpack that just a little bit, you know that he does admit altruism, that cooperation exists at the individual and even at the societal level. But he's thinking about it in a certain way. And we could all do that. I mean, we could all kind of take the view that it's good for us if our societies work well. It's good for me. Even if I don't care about anybody else, it's good for me alone to be in a society that works well compared to a society that doesn't work well. Therefore, that is my form of selfishness. I'm speaking that language, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, then there's another language which more or less parses things in a different way. And I think this is a very interesting way this multi-level reasoning is very interesting because it asks the questions at separate levels. If you look within a group, who's going to do best within a group? That's a comparative thing. And an important point to make here is that evolution is relentlessly comparable. It doesn't matter how well something survives and reproduces in absolute terms, only that it does so better than other units in the vicinity. And so that's what leads to disruptions of all sorts. It's in my effort to do better than you that I can accept all of us doing worse, basically, because I'm only interested in relative advantage. That's the pernicious thing about evolution, basically. It's because it is relative, then it's the struggle to do better than others that actually causes all of us to do worse.
But you have formulated this golden rule. Selfishness beats altruism within groups. Altruistic groups beat selfish groups. And everything else is commentary. But I just wonder, how does evolution find the balance between the two levels to make these selfish guys within the group take one for the team on a group level?
Well, one answer to that question is that evolution doesn't find a balance. There is, in any particular species, there is a balance of these opposing forces, and that depends on the details of their social structures. But it's a very important thing to know that there's many, many animal societies in which the within-group process, selfishness beats altruism within groups, is the strongest process. And in those societies, we would not want to live in those societies. We would regard those societies as despotic and horrible in human terms, in which basically the strong members of the society are exploiting the weak. That's the way it has been. That's the way it is. That's the way it always will be, unless something changes about the social structure. But another thing to say is that evolution does work on the balance. And so you can, the social structure can evolve to suppress the disruptive within-group forces, and so that the between-group force is the most important force. And those societies evolved to be very cooperative. And we are such a species. So we are a species in which between-group selection dominated within-group selection, mostly at the scale of small-scale groups, and created a primate species that was exceptionally cooperative. And that is exactly why we are so different from most other primate species.
So altruism was, in a way, our weapon in the evolution.
That's right. Altruism and cooperation in all its forms. So, and the only reason that's possible is because we have very effective mechanisms for suppressing self-serving behaviors. All of us is capable of being selfish. It's part of our repertoire, more for some than for others. But it's the ability to suppress that. It's in many small groups, including hunter-gatherer groups. If somebody tries to bully others or to dominate them, then they will be shut down because everyone else has the collective ability to do that. And it's only thanks to that social control system that it works. Take that social control system away, and then selfishness will come back in.
Well, yeah, it seems that the optimal social organization is where there exists very strong norms about justice and equality, and also law and order, a strong will to impose sanctions on members of the group that do not comply with the norms.
Yes, and this speaks to the whole nature of human morality, which makes great sense from an evolutionary perspective. I had a conversation with a moral philosopher a long time ago, Simon Blackburn. He's a famous moral philosopher from England. I said, before we talk about evolution, just define morality for me as you would in an introductory class. And he says, well, there's two sides to the morality coin. One side is coercive. We have rules, norms for how to behave, and if you don't, there's consequences. But then there's the voluntary side of morality, where I want to help you. I just want to help you as an end in itself. So these are two sides of the morality coin. And the reason that they go together is that the first side, the coercive side, provides the safe environment, the safe social environment for the voluntary side to be expressed. If the coercive side is in place, then I can freely express my desire to help you, and I will not be exploited. If you take away the coercive side, then if I try to help you, I know that I am liable to be exploited. And so that's why those two sides need to go together, and why evolution explains the basic nature of human morality.
You have a chapter about religion in your book. Could we say that religious people are more altruistic than others?
Not quite. But what we can say about the nature of religion, and this goes back all the way to all scholarly inquiry about religions. Why is it that we have this tendency to believe in the supernatural and more generally in counterfactual beliefs? Why do we believe in stuff that's not out there is the most general way to ask that question. And one kind of answer is that these false beliefs actually help us function better as communities. Durkheim said that a long time ago, so it's an old hypothesis. And yet it hasn't been settled until recently. I think one of the contributions of evolutionary theory those of us who have studied religion from an evolutionary perspective, is that we can say that Durkheim was approximately correct, and that most enduring religions do a good job of creating strong moral communities. Now, the reason that I qualified my answer is that for two reasons. One is there's other ways to do it. And so you could have other worldviews that are not religious and also create strong communities. So religion is one way to do it, but not the only way. And then another thing that we all need to know about altruism is that it is, in the spectrum, multi-level. It's typically within group altruism. I'm altruistic to other members of my group. And what my group does, the whole dilemma repeats itself. And so we have the specter of individuals that are behaving as good as gold towards members of their own group in order to exterminate other groups. And religions are as susceptible to that as any other kind of group. In fact, there's nothing you can say about religion that you can't say about other kinds of groups. And that's one reason why I'm actually critical of some of my colleagues, such as Richard Dawkins, and what's sometimes called the new atheism, for being so hostile to religion per se. It's not religion per se that's the problem. It's these other things that are the problem and the solution, and they're manifested in religion. So you mislocate the problem if you think that religion is the problem. You mislocate it. You have to see this broader picture in which religion is situated within the picture.
But maybe because religious beliefs are also deep within many people, it could be more dangerous when it gives people a free hand to do terrible things to people from other religions, consider that as enemies.
Well, that is a hypothesis, and you can test that hypothesis, and it actually, I would say it has been tested to a degree, and it proves to be false. So I was actually one of the first people to do something that's really simple and scientific. If you want to say something about religion, choose a random sample of religions so that you don't just cherry pick examples. Believe it or not, I'm one of the first people to have ever done that. And when you actually take a random sample of religions and you ask the question, how many of them spread by violent conquest? The answer is a very small minority. Think of Christianity. Think of Mormonism. Think of most of the Protestant religions that arose back then. So it's simply not the case, I claim, but it is an empirical question, that religions are more prone to violent conquest. I think the thing about all groups from an evolutionary perspective, they're like individuals, or at least we'd like them to be like individuals. When a group is not like an individual, it's because it's handicapped by selfishness within the group. When a group is like an individual, then like an individual, it's behaviorally flexible. It's capable of playing the war card or the peace card, and which one it plays depends on the circumstances. It's no different than an individual that way. And that's why all of these ideas, which are familiar to us at the level of individuals interacting in groups, can be scaled up so that we could look at it with the interactions of groups in a multi-group population. And so we can really think about the interactions among nations, for example, or corporations in much the same way as we think about the relationships between individuals and small groups. And we get a lot of intuitive insight out of doing it that way.
It's a very controversial question, but is there any empirical evidence that some religions are more peaceful than others?
Again, these are all hypotheses. And so it is a hypothesis that Islam, for instance, is more prone to violent conquest than others. And so let me say a little bit more about this. How does a religion evolve culturally? And part of this, I just want to assert, is that for so many people, they think about evolution only as genetic evolution. But what we need to do is think about evolution as all forms of change. So all the fast-paced changes that are going around about us, human history during the last 10,000 years, even the choices that we make on a moment-by-moment basis as individuals, all of these can be seen through this lens. And so if you take any major religion and you ask how did it evolve culturally, then you have to look at the range of circumstances. And so let's say that in some religions had to operate in violent and peaceful contexts, okay? Therefore, that flexibility will be built into their sacred texts. Let's say that a religion evolves only in a peaceful context. In that case, it will not have the flexibility to behave violently because it was never built into it. And so on for a religion that was only evolved in a violent context. Now, against that background, I think it's pretty clear that you can take any of the major religions, including Islam, and you can say that it evolved in a range of contexts. Islam arose as a merchant religion, and basically in the context of trade. It also has a very long militaristic history. What that means is that you can find passages in the Quran that more or less invoke peaceful behaviors or violent behaviors in the same way as you could find in any sacred text, including Buddhism. We like to think Buddhism is a pacifistic religion, but no, just look at the history.
Yeah, and look at Myanmar.
Look at any.
These days, yes.
Look at any.
Let's go to the field of economics.
Yes, please.
Which is the field, I think, where selfishness is very often recognized as natural and even good. Sayings like greed is good and the invisible hand that where people act in their selfish interests to the common good. In the end, Ayn Rand's books, which condemn altruism and would like to ban the word to give from the language. Selfishness serves the common good at the end. It is the creed, so to say. And you have this notion of the homo economicus, calculating individual, maximizing his own gain or profit in every situation. Is this creature founded in biology?
Yeah, so the short answer is no. So that's your take-home message. And to elaborate on that, first we have to say that the whole profession of economics is very diverse. And this particular school of thought is one school of thought with quite a shallow history. It only dates back to, well, it dates back to the 19th century, but really bloomed after World War II. The concept of laissez-faire is more central to economics as a whole. Laissez-faire, of course, means let it be, that if you want the economy to work well, you don't try to regulate it. There's some sense in which it's going to work itself, the invisible hand of the market. And that idea, I think, is pre-Darwinian. If you trace it, it goes back to ideas of harmony and order, which simply are not the case. It is not the case that a large social system of any sort will function well if you don't regulate it. And one of the great, I think, metaphorical advantages, something we could all appreciate, is that if we begin to think of society as like an organism, then we begin to think of regulation as like biological regulation. And in organisms, they only survive thanks to hundreds and hundreds of processes that are being regulated. To be unregulated is to be dead if you're an organism. And so if society is like an organism, it needs to be regulated like an organism. And the idea that regulation is a bad word, that government is bad, 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 these are all, not only are they fictions, but they're extremely dangerous fiction. So what you get is you get Ayn Rand and the greed is good. It's a worldview. It is a moral worldview because it's only by claiming that society works well in this way that anyone would pay attention to it. And yet when you examine it, you find it is simply not the case. And so you might say it's a parasitic worldview. And the reason that it spreads is because it does indeed benefit some individuals at the expense of others, but it is not good for society as a whole. And we need to see that very clearly. It's probably the most destructive force on the planet right now. Don't worry about religion, worry about free market ideology. That's the thing to worry about. I call it a stealth religion.
I wonder to what extent can altruism or selfishness be learned? We have these examples of all these kinds of games, of sharing a sum of money, how much do you claim for yourself, how much do you offer the others. And I believe I've read that economy students become more selfish during the course of their studies, while other students, with them it's the other way around. So what does this tell us?
I don't think it's a matter of learning so much as two other things. One is a social environment that is genuinely protective of altruism. I noticed that Dag talked about Elinor Ostrom and her core design principles. You can design a group so that it is protective of altruism. And it has such things to do with basically, let's make sure that we all do our part. Let's make sure that decision-making is open. Let's make sure that agreed upon behaviors are monitoring. These are nuts and bolts things. So let's just design our groups like that, and that will be half of the solution. The other half of the solution is to have a worldview that actually makes altruism appear to be the right thing to do. If you take the free market worldview, the Ayn Rand worldview, the reason it counts as a moral system is that if you step into it, and if you accept its tenets, then all of a sudden it seems that greed is good. That if you do these things, the society will work better. And because that's the story that you've been told, then you think you're being pro-social by behaving in this particular way. So you need to have a worldview that actually appropriately informs the right behavior, and then you need the social environment so that when you do behave in this way, then you are not exploited. And neither one of those is really learning, right? Isn't it interesting that learning is not what it's about? Once you provide both of these things, then you don't have to learn, basically. People will do them spontaneously.
You write about a very interesting project in your own local community in Binghamton, where you find that differences in what you call pro-social behavior, even from neighborhood to neighborhood.
Yeah.
How can that be?
Well, what we did is we measured pro-sociality. I like the word pro-social better than the word altruism, because altruism has an element of self-sacrifice involved, whereas pro-sociality is just about if it's good for others and society as a whole, then I'm agnostic about whether it's good for you. I hope it is. Let's have win-win situations whenever possible. So we measured pro-sociality in all of the public school students. So we had about 3,000 kids, basically, and we measured their individual differences. And then we related that to various forms of social support, their family, their neighborhood, their school, their church, and extracurricular activities. And the idea here, the theory here, very simply, is that for pro-sociality to succeed as a social strategy in Darwinian terms, those who give must get. That's the only way that it can be sustained. If you're a giver, give, you'll disappear unless you're getting. And so your social environment has to be pro-social for you to be pro-social. And so what we were looking for was a correlation that the most highly pro-social individuals were also the most nurtured individuals. And we got a very high correlation, about 0.7, in the whole city. And then we took the location of their houses, their residential location, and we created physical maps of where they lived. And we showed that they were highly clustered, so that and that was just one form of social support, but such an important form of social support that neighborhood by neighborhood, then the most pro-social kids were clustered. And then we did other studies. For example, there's a famous experiment in social psychology where you take stamped envelopes and you drop them on the sidewalks, and you want to know who's kind enough to pick up the envelope and mail it for you. And the address in the envelope all goes to one place, and the return address provides the information in the neighborhood in which you dropped it. So that's how the experiment is done. Well, we did that experiment, and we showed that in the neighborhoods where most of the kids were pro-social according to the survey, lo and behold, those are the ones where you get the envelopes. And then we looked at holiday decorations. So why do you decorate your house? Why do you go to that effort? It's kind of a neighborly thing to do. And so we drove around the neighborhoods on Christmas time, and we scored the holiday decorations, and lo and behold, the neighborhoods in which most of the kids were pro-social, according to our survey, were those which were most brightly lit. And by the way, it was not just about money. Actually, quite the contrary, because if you think of it in sociological terms, what they call social capital trades off against financial capital. If you have a lot of money, you don't need to cooperate, do you? Because you can pay with a credit card. And so the most pro-social kids and neighborhoods were those that didn't have that much money, and so therefore they were in practice doing things together. What's called dugnad in Norway was what they were practiced at doing. But the wealthiest neighborhoods actually scored relatively low in pro-sociality, but the worst off of all, the most miserable children of all, were those that had neither financial capital nor social capital. Those were the lost souls.
So the middle is the best here. But how far could that be influenced by the example of opinion leaders within a community?
You mentioned the examples of norms before, and I'd like to return to that because one reason that we're so flexible as a species is because we have this general capacity to have and enforce norms, but the actual content of those norms is hugely variable. And so we really want to think about how do we have the norms that we do, and how can we establish new norms? And here's where we get to such things as opinion leaders. A norm has to be made salient. Not only do we need to know what it is, but we need to know that it's important. And the way that we know it's important is if the respected people among us actually say and think it's important. I've actually written on this two hot topics nowadays, at least in the United States, and also worldwide. One is sexual bullying. There are powerful people.
Here as well.
Powerful people basically making unwanted sexual advances at less powerful people. And the other one is truth-telling, fake news, basically. Tell the truth. Now, in both cases, almost everyone will agree in the abstract that these are things you shouldn't do, okay? And yet, how salient have they been made? In order for that to happen, we need to have an assertion of norms. That it's not just we shouldn't do it, we really shouldn't do it. And so therefore, we have to make that point. And then we need to monitor it. There needs to be transparency. And then there has to be consequences if you actually deviate. So I think what's taking place in the United States and perhaps worldwide is an establishment of a norm, so that what was disapproved of but nevertheless took place in the past now will not take place nearly as much in the future. It will always take place to a degree. So I see a norm shift in the making for sexual bullying that is fascinating to observe. Now with truth-telling, it seems to be going the other way. And we seem to be having an erosion of norms with respect to truth-telling. But with truth-telling, what's so fascinating with all norms, it gets back to what we said about neighborhoods. If you look at cultural traits of all forms, and if you survey them, as I did pro-sociality, what you find is they have what an ecologist would call a distribution and abundance. If you measure the geographical distribution of a non-human species, it's here or it's not here. It has a geographical distribution. If you measure a human behavior, such as truth-telling or sexual bullying, it's here or not here, depending upon basically the norms. And so you can certainly find areas of social life in which sexual bullying doesn't occur because of the normative ingredients are there. If you look at truth-telling, if you look at the scientific community, the scholarly community, norms of truth-telling are firmly in place. If you don't abide by them, then it just reflects upon you real fast. And the peer review process, both the informal and the formal peer review process, makes sure that happens. In judicial proceedings, you have to swear the whole truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God, right? Why does religion come in there? Doesn't that strike you as so curious? You know, what does God have to do with it, other than to basically affirm the importance of this, basically, and the consequences if you violate it? So the norms of truth-telling are firmly in place in that context. In journalism, the norms of truth-telling are sometimes in place. If you're a responsible journalist, and if you aren't, clear about your sources and so on, sometimes that reflects very poorly on you. You won't get very far in that profession if you're not responsible, and yet that's a profession in which that seems to be going away. Then you get to the internet, and you get to this much looser world of the internet in which the norms don't exist at all, and now you get a complete abandonment of those norms. That's where fake news flourishes. So knowing this and thinking about it in this way actually helps us to do what you could call restoration of society. If you're an ecologist and you want to restore a species, then you provide the growth conditions for that species, and then that species becomes more widespread. We can actually restore norms if we know what to do. And so these ideas are very, very practical. Thinking of them in this way could actually cause us to do these good things.
But you write that norms of altruism function better within small groups. And yet you also emphasize that we need a global altruism to cope with today's challenges. But how do we do that? You describe yourself the development in the media, where the development of social media makes it more difficult to uphold norms and so on, and you have the same thing in other fields.
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge progress where it has occurred. And during the last 10,000 years, the scale of cooperative human society has increased from tiny groups embedded in tiny tribes to the mega societies of today. And the best functioning nations, of which Norway is one, cooperate at an impressive scale. And that's thanks to the norms and so on and so forth. So it's not true that norms only exist at a small scale. They do exist at a large scale, actually a very impressively large scale. So the question really is, how do we scale them up still further? And an important message from all of this, it's a very fundamental message, because as we've seen, altruism permutes to selfishness. Altruism, when it's expressed within any unit, whether it's a single group or a nation, tends to be disruptive at the higher scale. And here we get to issues, for example, of Norway actually turning selfish when it comes to its pension fund and its oil development and so on and so forth. What's good for Norway can be bad for the world. And what do we do about that? And so the only way to solve the global problem is to have the welfare of the whole earth in mind. All of this leads to a planetary ethic. All of this leads to a whole earth ethic, that we must first and foremost have the welfare of the whole earth in mind. And then we must orchestrate everything below that. That does not necessarily require self-sacrifice or self-abnegation. It can be healthful and sustaining at all levels, but only if you organize it in the right way. Now, many of us have a planetary ethic, so that's not new. But what is new is the scientific support for that ethic. There's a very, very deep and fundamental way in which we can say, evolution says, science says, that if we're going to solve these problems, we need to begin with, we need to be planetary altruists, basically. And the idea that what's good for me can be good for everyone, that's the idea of the invisible hand. The pursuit of lower level self-interest somehow mysteriously, robustly benefits the common good. This is not true. And it's not true at any scale. So my nation first, my wonderful president, don't we love him, who says, I'm putting American first and I expect you to put, you all to put your nations first, that is catastrophic. That is absolutely catastrophic.
I told you I would confront you with a couple of dilemmas in the end. Firstly, we have had a discussion in this country, how many refugees should we take from Syria? Some argue that we should take more out of a moral obligation. Others argue that we could help more refugees by using the money to help them where they are in the neighboring countries. And I suspect that the motive of most of these people is that they do not want more refugees here. And the first group has definitely occupied the moral high ground in the discussion. But if deeds are more important than motives, could the second group still turn out to be the more effective altruists, although their motives might be dubious?
So I want to expand that question without dodging it. I'm not dodging the question, no. But I think that one thing that we can say is that a nation such as Norway works well for reasons. And if you disrupt those reasons, then that's something you don't want to do, basically. Any nation that works well, any group that works well, needs to be able to articulate why and export that and not import things that disrupts why it works well. Now, when you look at the various importations, things that are coming into Norway that could potentially disrupt it as a society that functions well, immigrants might be one, in which case the idea that you could have, you basically swamp a social system with a huge input of immigrants, that's a logical possibility. That's not dumb. That's something which would need to be considered. But we better think about other things that are being imported. And I think the importation of, or you might say the imposition of a neoliberal economic system is something that we should be worrying about more than the importation of some immigrants. And so if you now have, basically through the aggressive assertion of global economic policies, which more or less force you to create a two-tier wage system, when in fact one of the reasons that Norway works is because it has a compression, high minimum wage and relatively low maximum wage. One of the things that makes it work well, then you're disrupting a system. And we need to be vigilant, basically. Any group needs to be vigilant about all aspects of disruption. Then to return to immigrants, I think that, and before we think about the numbers, we need to think about what we do with any numbers. And how do we work with immigrant groups? And then to solve what is essentially a cultural mismatch. And here the concept of mismatch, that when any system, a genetic system or a cultural system, evolved in the context of one environment, and then the environment suddenly changes, that creates a mismatch between what used to be adaptive and now is no longer adaptive. And immigration is just a case of cultural mismatch that needs to be addressed. And so what needs to be done is, in any numbers, we need to take the people that are coming in bearing their own cultures, and now we're expecting to live in a new culture, and we need to accomplish that transition. I would suggest that one way to do that is through the formation of small groups, and for those groups to be a mix of immigrant people and Norwegians, sympathetic Norwegians, who then undergo a reflection as to how we're going to now make this transition and then bring in social resources in order to do that. And that way now you can, and without necessarily eliminating the culture. Who wants to shed their culture? At least over the short term. So I think that there's smart ways to accomplish assimilation, which are for the most part not being followed. We need to work on that for immigration in any numbers. And at that point, I think there is a sense in which you need to cap numbers. And it also speaks to the fact that why we need planetary solutions, because the fact that we have this problem in the first place is because of planetary dysfunction which is creating these problems lower down the scale. So we need to solve the global problems.
So the second dilemma concerns Norway as an oil-producing nation. If stopping global warming requires that some of the oil resources are left in the ground, should we unilaterally offer to phase out our production and stop the search activity to the benefit of the planet? Or, as the oil lobby argues, could that lead to a worse result for the globe as a whole? If the remaining oil is produced under worse environmental conditions and the profit goes to a small elite instead of being spent on welfare and partly on foreign aid as we do.
Yeah, so...
what is the better altruistic alternative?
So this is a great example of where if you shrink down the problem and think of it in the context of individuals and small groups, you can get a lot of insight. And my colleague, Robert Frank, an economist, an evolutionary economist who's been over here, has a great metaphor. So in the game of hockey, if you're a hockey player, you should want to wear a helmet because you won't get concussions and stuff like that. On the other hand, in any game, someone who doesn't wear a helmet has an advantage over someone who does, or the team that's not wearing helmets has an advantage over the team that does, because you can see better and all that. And so how do you get so that everyone wears a helmet? There actually has to be a norm, an agreement, that everyone must wear a helmet with penalties if they don't. And at that point, then everyone's happy. They're all wearing helmets. There's not a competitive disadvantage. And so now if we scale that up, you can say that if we could get some kind of agreement so that all of us leave the oil in the ground, then we won't have the competitive disadvantage that you just talked about. Well, that might not happen. So what might also happen? What else takes place in small groups? If you're the only cooperator in a group and everyone else is not cooperating, then you're really in a hard place. You cannot continue to be a cooperator because you'll just go away. What you need to do is you need to work on a critical mass. Just get enough cooperators so that you could actually work with each other. And also there's the idea of a moral example. We see in small groups that if someone is bold enough to say that I'm going to do this, despite the fact that I'm going to suffer from it, that could actually be the stance that causes others to follow suit, and you can create that consensus. And I think there's examples there at the national level. And Norway, in some respects, is also a leader in this respect, basically setting a moral example. And then the way that can work is if others follow suit. So without waiting for some kind of agreement, which might not happen, simply to say, we're not going to do this because we're global citizens and there's some ways that we know that we could make money, but we're not. Now, how about you?
Well, we'll see what the oil minister will do about it. I think we could have discussed this for a long time, but time is up. I don't think we have time for questions from the floor, or a few questions. Okay, great. So, is there anyone? Yeah. Oh, you were just waving the microphone. Okay. No one?
Going once? Twice?
Well, just the final question. Can altruism go too far? You write in your book that the cat needs claws.
Yeah, this is more or less carries forth what we once said. You should not. The reason that altruism doesn't exist is when it's not it can't survive as a social strategy. I often ask the question, let's say that you're an altruist and unluckily for you, you're surrounded by non-altruists. What are your options, okay? One is you can leave. If you can't do that, maybe you can convert others to be altruists. If you can't do that, maybe you should turn off your altruism for the time being, just to protect yourself. The fourth option is to remain an altruist and suffer the consequences. Really, we should not counsel that fourth option. And this is like Norway saying, you know, why should we leave the oil in the ground when others are not? Maybe we should continue to extract the oil and then do good things with it. So that's the logic behind that. And so that means, and this is very important because it happens all the time that we counsel people to be altruistic. And that's unethical if we were to succeed at doing that and then place them back in their social environment where they will only be exploited. This speaks to the need to change the environment and not necessarily the individual. So you don't take an alley cat and declaw it and put it back in the alley. That would be unethical. You have to be smarter than that. You have to create the social system that causes altruism to succeed. There's a term that's becoming common, niche construction. An ecological niche, of course, are the conditions that allow a species to thrive. But humans construct their niches and have for a long time. And so we need to construct the niches that enable us to be pro-social. Isn't it interesting that that term is really equivalent to the term social construction, right? And so a social constructivist is a whole wing of humanist disciplines, which for the most part has been hostile to biology. So if you look at the academic history of this, we see that humanistic disciplines, for the most part, have been eager to declare independence from biology and associate biology with genes and determinism and all of these things. But really what we've come to is a view of social constructivism which is informed by evolution and biology and can make social constructivism stronger and more effective. So there is actually a unification of academic disciplines here, which we haven't talked about, but which is extremely important and part of the solution.
David, thank you very much for coming.
Okay, thank you.